Record button. According to my clock, it's straight up 7 o'clock. I'd like to welcome everybody to the I-29 Moo University and the Northern Plains Forage Association webinar series. This continues this evening with a variety of forage topics, including an overview of virtual fencing, grazing cover crops, and winter annuals, plus a look at the outlook. This webinar series is an extension of the annual Forage Field Day sponsored each summer by I-29 and the Northern Plains. It's rotated amongst Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. This webinar will be archived on the I-29 Moo University website, and that is at i-29moou.com/forages. Each month we have three 30-minute presentations followed by a question and answer session. You can add questions in the chat box at the bottom of the window, and if the presenters don't get to them during the discussion, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. We're starting out this evening's presenters with Yijie Xiong, Nebraska Extension engineer. She notes that labor is tight and input costs aren't getting any cheaper. If you're looking for ways to stretch your forage further, virtual fencing might be a good tool worth your consideration. These GPS-enabled collars allow you to create or move paddock boundaries from your phone or computer. No posts, no reels, no fence to drag across the pasture. She joined the University of Nebraska Department of Animal Science in 2020 as an assistant professor and extension precision livestock management specialist. She is a split appointment between animal science and the Department of Biological Systems Engineering. As I always say, Yijie, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to discuss virtual fencing as a potential tool that can help you make grazing more efficient. So, the topic I want to cover today, let's talk about technology. Here we go. Is some of the basics is what that is and where are we now with the technology. And then I want to you guys to leave with this webinar with knowing your options and knowing what to consider. And then if time allows, I would be love to share some of the current research effort that we're doing and some of the producer's voice about user experience using virtual fence with their grazing management. Okay, so first off, what is virtual fencing? I bet if you guys have some invisible fence for your dogs, I'm hoping some of you are familiar with the concept. That is exactly the same thing. Okay, however, we're using it on cattle. So there's a lot of definition, but this is one that works for me, and I want to highlight some important components of that. So basically, it is an invisible barrier created using GPS system, and then to keep cattle in or out of an area by providing them with some either sound or mild shock uh, to stimulate to encourage them to comply. So this is a slide that I really enjoy showing. Um, basically, and it's surprising to know that the virtual fencing concept and it can be dated back to 1970s. And that's when how that's how long technology takes from having the ideas, having the proof of concept to really bloom of the application. So on the right hand side, if you can see my cursor on screen, so this poor steer is facing is equipped with a lot of electronics on his head, um, and almost look like an alien cow, but according to the literature, that actually work pretty well. So now let's dive into how it works in theory and then in application, and then I will walk you through for a few products that we have right now. So how it works in theory, basically there's a few components. And first off, you will have a GPS collar on your cattle. And then this collar, they're all using a technology called Internet of Things, similar to how your surveillance camera or your doorbell is working. So it will transmit a signal either through a base station, what we call it tower, or just by cellular embedded systems to the back end or the server of the company. And then from this connection, you can actually create or draw virtual boundaries. Either its inclusion zone is where I'm circling right now, or excluding them from this area. And then depends on the products. They might have a little distance between this barrier versus this barrier, but sometimes other company will have only one altogether consolidated line for virtual fence. So how that works is I sort of explained that earlier. And then the beauty of the virtual fence is it's actually just one-way gate. So thinking that if you have a curious animal that when outside of the boundary with even like multiple stimuli, when it's coming back from the outside of the fence back to the inclusion zone of the fence, it will actually do not receive another repeated stimuli. So basically, all the stimuli circle starts fresh again. And also like because of the Internet of Things technology, when an animal is escaped or considered escaped, or when an animal or a collar has not been moving for a prolonged period of time, you can actually get a notification either through your phone app or a text or an email. Um, so I want to point out again, like most of us are understanding that we can graze the animals inside of the virtual fences, but actually you can also create exclusion zone instead of an inclusion zone so that they will be spending time over here without coming into this area. And that can be pretty handy if you have some protected area or really wet area that you don't want your animals to continue grazing them. And one thing to mention that all of the companies have pointed this part out is that virtual fencing is to designed to replace interior fencing, but it's not designed to replace the physical perimeter fences. So you still should have pretty solid and efficient perimeter fences. And training is pretty important. Um, Different companies have different protocols, but they all share the same principles. So basically, when you're starting things out, which I can show you from the bottom figure, the first step that I recommend my producers do is always just overlay the virtual fence to your physical perimeter fences. So why do I do that? So think about this way, like training your cattle is pretty similar to train your dogs, right? You want to expose something completely new for them, but then you want to associate them with something they know what to think of it. So if you have a electric fence trained cattle, and then they will understand that, okay, when I start to hear some sound or even followed by shock, then I know that when the sound is sounding, I see this physical fence. Either it's electric or physical. And then initially after they start to associate the sound, to seeing a invisible physical boundary, and then you can start to increase the challenge for them. So basically, randomly reduce the area of the inclusion zone, and then start to cut corners and make them more challenging for the cattle, so that they start to be reinforced and retrained, and start to make solid connection between audio cues versus the physical fence. And if you have really highly efficiently trained cattle, and then we want a lot more audio cues than shocks. So if you can have like basically that means they are respecting the sound pretty efficiently without needing a being shocked. So what are some of our current products? And I'm listing these four major companies right here. And Vance is the only one invented and designed in the United States back in 2021. And starting 2024, a lot of these companies that were designing virtual fences majorly for dairy cattle started to enter in the United States market. So I'm going to jump out of the slides. I want to show you what they look like with me holding that in my hand. See if I can do that. Okay. You guys still see me? So talking about this is the Vans color that I have in my hand is really light, and the shock will be administered through the chain. Next one up is I have this one is called E-Shepherd. It's actually designed by the Gallagher in Australia, and then you can buy them from the North America Gallagher. It's a bit heavier and bigger, but it's pretty robustly built. And then the next one I have is this is a pretty cool technology from New Zealand. This is called Halter. And you can tell like they have solar panels, and then it's a lot more elegantly designed and small minimal design. And this is a counterweight. And the shock and the sound are administered by these electronic pins. So these are the only three products that I have either project with or have a demo color. I am actually having no fence color delivered to me next week, so I don't have that in my hand to show you. Let's come back up to the screen. So Fred, if you can see my screen back up, can you give me a thumb up?
Yep, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay. And then I have these all on one sheet if you want to get a screenshot or get notes or contact me, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. Instead, I want to show you how effective virtual fence can be. So this is a video, and hopefully you guys can hear what I hear. Let me make sure, okay? Before I start to clicking, I want you to pay attention to this red steer. And basically the virtual fence is relatively on a pie shape. So somewhere right here that he is trying to graze. And here we go. Okay. One more time. I hope you guys can hear that sound. And then basically, this is exactly what we want the animals to do is when they hear the sound, they start to back off without needing a shock. Now, next one is I have a front stock that was uh, playing outside of the pasture. So you can tell like these calves, they do not have the virtual fence collars, but then this mom cow, they do have virtual fence collars. So pay attention to their behaviors. Okay, just one last time. Okay, I'm hoping either you could hear that sound or not, but based on their behavior and reaction, you can tell that they were pretty respectful to the virtual fence. Okay, so then as a producer, what do you need to know? Okay, so I'm trying to consolidate and aggregate some information, and I put together this section for you to consider. So first off, um, as some barriers, unfortunately, as a pretty new technology, the cost is still relatively high. However, I want to make it optimistic. I want to make an optimistic estimate that the cost will eventually reduce, just like how phones cost are, and how your Wi-Fi network is reducing the cost every along the days. So if you can overcome these two barriers, I think you are probably going to be at frontiers of the virtual fence. Okay, so here I have some information for you, and then this is a handout that I put together. Basically, aggregate all the informations and basic fact sheets by different products and different functionality. So you can tell like there are two purchase modes for all four companies. And basically the Vance collar and the halter collars are on a leasing agreement. So you pay for subscription or renting the collars. You do not own the collars. Um, and then all the costs were included in the subscriptions, meaning that if something happens to a collar, either it's a cow or by some accidents that break the collar or something is not working just by itself, they will replace the collars for you at no cost. Now, I may sound like these two don't do that, but they actually do. So, to my knowledge, all the companies are having a 5 years warranty. So meaning that if something happens within this 5 years and you do have a free and pretty robust replacement. And we've done that with a lot of our collars that we use for research. And again, these informations have a lot, and I can do all day and just introducing the difference. But I want to point out the important things for you. So, basically, other than vents and no fence, they all have a solar panel. So even no fence, they have a lithium battery inside that you can replace, but they also have a solar panel. So Vance is the only one that you have to consider replacing batteries once in a while. And then all of these are offering either a cellular connection or a base tower if you have absolutely a cellular dead zone in your operation. And again, like Vents and Halter are kind of similar in operation, and then No Fence and Gallagher, they are operated on cellular, with the exception that the E-Shepherd can also have a base station. And then, so what I did is something simple and stupid is I created a a estimated cost. I'm assuming, big assuming, assumption is I have 500 herd that I want to use virtual fencing, and then I'm using it for 5 years. So what I did is I included and considered all these either capital cost or subscription cost, and then I basically spread that cost to each herd, each head and each month. So again, you could tell that the more you use it, the longer you use it, it's actually being more affordable and probably more economic. Well, I also have a different scenario that is only 100 head, and then for 1 year commitment on the web resource hub that I set it up, and you can see that the first year cost is a lot more than if you have used it for 4 years, 5 years, or even longer. Okay, now I do want to mention working with technology is kind of like, for example, you do have to face a lot of uh, things on your phone, on your computer, and then you have to be confident that you can operate some fence movement using either your phones or your computer. I know that sounds simple, right? But actually, to a lot of people, it can be a challenge. However, I have experience. I have two male graduate students. They were really impatient. And by the end of their project, they are masters of virtual fencing. So if you have the time and patience, anything is possible, and you can master using virtual fence on your phone or on your computer. Um, Okay, so how do you select virtual fence products, right? And this is something that I hopefully that you can understand the product features, and more importantly is you need to understand and know what your operation and grazing management needs are because they do matter. So, for example, as I mentioned that in order for virtual fence to work, there is a requirement for some sort of connectivities. Either you have a base station or you have a cellular network, right? So, like Shelby is in Ames area and probably is going to be better and easier than some more rural places than outside of the city. So that is your one limitation right there. However, if you believe that is something workable or you are willing to invest in a base station or tower, then you have the next step to understand and worry about. So what is your management needs, right? The reason why I have this one up is so we all know that continuous grazing requires less interior fencing and cross fencing than all of these. And if you think these rotational grazing and strip grazing are easier, then probably the creep grazing and leaf fowler requires a lot more cross fencing that is labor intensive to pro to prevent us from actually doing that, even though we probably all know there's nutritional and animal performance benefits of these intensive management practices. So then the next question you want to ask yourself is what size of pasture and grazing do you plan to use virtual fence for? If you have small pastures and intensive management, then you probably want to have a collar that was high accuracy, and then you want to have solar collars, which will recharge by itself without needing to replace the battery because more interaction for example, the intensive grazing will have a lot more interaction um, going through the grazing period. That means it will drain your batteries more often. Um, so you might have to consider a drained battery situation for intensive grazing. However, in some other locations like big country terrain, and then you just want to know where your animals are, you just want to understand like, okay, I just want to do really big continuous grazing or really less frequent rotational grazing, then some GPS accuracy can be lower, and then also like you probably will be satisfied with both replaceable batteries and solar. And then you probably know this by nature is solar colors are easier to work with, right? You don't have to run them up and then and run them through the chute or replace the batteries. So, as a simple practice is I have these selection scenarios and these I want to do. So basically, if you follow those logic trees that I just mentioned, and then you will have basically come up with these uh, uh, criteria that you have to consider when selecting your um, products. So based on these selection scenarios, I basically settle up with these three because they offer the features that I need. And then probably if you have a um, really big or smaller and you can narrow it down further. I do see two questions. Let me see if I can get that up. Okay. Um, so next is now you might want to ask like, then how do I decide and know what to look for? So one challenge of working with a technology is that you have to understand things from your screen, right? So for example, I do have, oh, I'm not there yet. So for example, looking at these two screenshots, um, and I asked students about this, like, do you worried about this calf, this cow, or are you worried about this steer, right? So what you're looking at is basically each color represents a herd and they are assigned to a different paddock. And apparently we have a mixture of blue in the yellow, while this one is basically by itself. So this our students are really smart and creative. Like they know that this is okay. All it requires is some resorting. But this one, we actually discovered that she was having a split hoof that needs a little bit doctoring. So one benefit of having technology like this is you can also see the records and you can understand and maybe figure out some patterns that you might be missed if you rely on watching and monitoring your herd on horseback or in the ranger. Okay. So basically, what I'm again, like I sound like a salesman probably, but really the purpose of this is that a virtual fence is a tool in your toolbox. And maybe a lot of things are hard to measure right now. So for example, the time save on manual fencing, and then also like to put it, peace of mind is how do you measure the economic value of peace of mind, right? They're really hard to measure, but peace of mind is a lot of a very frequent word that I hear producers mention about the biggest benefit of having virtual fence. And then exclusion zone is something you can uh, think about being creative and designing your pastures. So, um, I think these are hard to measure, but I think with time, and honestly, we are probably only in year three for bloomed application of virtual fencing, and I'm really confident that myself and my colleagues at University of Nebraska Lincoln and other universities are working on having some economic analysis of return in investment for virtual fencing technology. So with time, that's some information will be really useful and really handy for us to have. I don't think I have a lot of time. So what I'm gonna do is instead of showing you in theory or everything that I have for research, what I want to show is some really cool photos. So this slide is basically a ongoing project that we have with my colleague Mary Janowski. So we are having a total of 100-acre pie shape oats field. And we wanted to evaluate and performance and grazing efficiency between continuous grazing versus intensive grazing. And again, the forage is oats. So treatments, we have three. Um, these that you see is actually we're doing weekly movement using virtual funds. So you can sort of see the guided line that I have in the map. They're not physical. Anything is you see here is invisible. And then we have a much more intensive one is we are moving these strips in these pastures daily. So every day we are giving them a fresh strip to graze. And then lastly, we have the continuous grazing is you see here, they don't have anything. And each treatment we have 4 reps. We turned this out November 20th last year. Can't believe how fast this already 2026. And yesterday, I just went and flew the drone and I think you guys can see this is pretty cool, right? So basically this is the weekly continuous and this is the weekly and this is the daily one. And they were standing pretty well um, just by the fence. So I think you can probably see the benefits of intensive grazing and then see the benefits of using virtual fence as a tool for that. Um, so this is what I want to share with you all today. And the last slide I have would be some of my contact information. You have more questions, and then also the a QR code for some of the information that we are putting together and put it public for the website and for you to access. Fred, you are muted.
There we go. Thank you. How many acres can a single system control? I know you had 100 acres in your test plot there, but what kind of maximum are you looking at?
This is a very interesting question because normally I got asked is how small can virtual funds go, right? Um, and I that's a good question. So based on different products, I know that it has effect to do with how wide your connectivity can cover. So I'm gonna guess is pretty big. We've gone 100 acres. I know that folks are doing like a few hundred acres, no problem. And really, if you want to expand on your coverage, what you can do is you can add more towers into your property. And so basically you're creating a big net for your virtual funds to work. Now, cellular wise is probably as long as you have cellular and is going to work.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll probably have questions at the end. I am going to talk with Andrew just a minute, if he wouldn't mind unmuting. It seems like he is a virtual fence researcher from SDSU and has a virtual user guide. Can you give us just a little insight to what you've got there, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, hi. My name's Andrew Antea. I'm a researcher with SDSU. Um, Most of my previous research was actually at the University of Arizona. We were received a couple grants to put together some educational materials, which is that first link I pasted in chat. It's 6 or 7 extension fact sheets as well as 3 webinar recordings and a handful of videos.
Okay, well,
My,
thank you very much. I wasn't aware of that, but I guarantee that link will probably get some pretty good use from this group. So thank you again. Uh, Again, we'll have more time at the end. Our next presenter for the day is Dr. Shelby Gruss, Iowa State University Forage Specialist. She notes that interest in grazing cover crops has been expanding, very popular in the southern part of the state, and with the difference in growing conditions, data on the growth potential in the northern part of the state along the I-29 corridor is growing. Dr. Gruss is an assistant professor and forage extension specialist with Iowa State University Department of Agronomy and joined the organization in 2023. Her major role is forage management with hay, pasture, and silage. Dr. Gruss, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was unmuted. Thanks for having me today. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about winter grazing strategies. Fred and I talk a little bit sometimes about basically this webinar and some ideas. And when we started talking about virtual fence grazing strategies, especially winter grazing strategies, kind of popped into my mind because I feel like they could really go hand in hand. And so we're not going to talk about all of them today. We're going to talk about some of them. There's a lot of options out there, and I probably could talk about each individual grazing strategy fairly easily. And but today we're going to little talk about like seasonal forage growth, why this is so important, kind of the economic value of being able to feed as long as we possibly can. We're going to talk about stockpiling, swath grazing, and some corn stover grazing. I feel like here in Iowa, if I don't talk about corn stover grazing, it's a really missed opportunity with how much corn we have. Then a little bit about incorporating these strategies into your operation. And just some final thoughts as we head out and I pass it off. And so if you've seen one of my presentations, I probably have something similar to this every time. I love this chart. I just love thinking about when are we going to have forage? When is it going to be growing? And here in the Midwest, we typically have a cool season based forages in our pastures. And so we get really good relative yields throughout the spring. And then we kind of taper off in the summertime time frame. And then we have another bump in the fall. But that leaves a lot of time where we could be feeding hay and we don't have enough forage growing in our pastures to be able to support our animals. And really the big time frame in that is winter feed. And that could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on conditions and things like that. Early onset, I mean, granted, it seems like winter starts later and later every year, but it's a really big cost for us. There's a lot of cost that goes into our stored feed cost. And if we're considering feeding hay, particularly, this is just a short comparison. It's a little bit older of data, but it still kind of starts to break down where some of these costs are going. And so if we're looking at if you're making hay and you're feeding hay throughout the winter, what it can cost you. And so we have our cost for making your own hay, all at a cost of for purchase hay. And purchase prices, yeah, they vary year to year. I just selected one at the time, and this was, I think, medium quality hay. It's a little bit old. I should have updated it, but that's beyond the point. What we can see here, though, is if we make our own hay, if they're considering land prices, fertilizers, everything from fuel repairs, kind of starting calculating that in, we're looking at about $120 per ton of hay. And I mean, land prices seem to always go up. So this is a little older. So we're probably looking a little higher than this at this point. But we're looking at about $2.12 per cow per day in this scenario. And then if we have purchase hay, it's even higher. It's about $3.18 per cow per day. And this is an estimation of we're having, I think it's 30 pounds of dry matter consumed a day. And then as we go into grazing, this is taking into consideration again, land prices and fertilizer costs for our pastures and maintenance at $150 per acre. And if we have it at $150 per acre to maintain that, we're looking at about $1.25 per cow per day. Almost $1 difference, and that can really add up very quickly depending on herd size in days. And so, I mean, if you're just looking at 1 week for 100 cows, that's getting close to 600 some dollars. So that's a lot of money that could be saved. So really thinking about how we can expand that grazing season can be really important. This scenario, the grazing scenario, is based on if it's a perennial pasture. Depending on techniques, annual plantings can increase these costs, but we're still looking at a lower price in comparison to making our own hay in these situations. And so there's a really big benefit by extending that grazing season. But one thing we do need to consider is a lot of times this may not be as high a quality of a product or high quality of a forage in comparison to, say, during the summer. And so we need to be thinking about those animal requirements as we go into winter. And if we need to be thinking about supplementation, and just in case they fall short, especially if we think about a spring calving situation, our animals, after they've been bred back, we're looking at considering them going from second to third trimester throughout this period. We're starting to see increased energy requirements. And so we have our protein requirements are increasing for our heifers and our cows, and then also our total digestible nutrient requirements. So overall, our energy requirements are increasing during this time. And so just knowing what animals we are having out there grazing, just in case we need to be thinking about supplementation. And in some cases, it's not going to be an issue, but just having an idea to make sure that our animals are getting the nutrients they need. And so now we're going to just hop into a little bit of these grazing strategies, and we're going to start off with stockpiling. I think stockpiling is a great opportunity. I know I get a lot of, I'm getting compressed and not being able to expand acres, but stockpiling is a way basically to utilize the pastures we have, and it's deferring our grazing till later. And so it's a way basically of saving our pastures to graze in the fall and the winter. And so we got to plan ahead and being able to set aside that area out of our rotation so that we can make sure we have that time frame we need to basically allow the particularly cool season grasses to continue to grow. And so this is trying to take advantage of that growth pattern where our cool season grasses will have that increase in growth during the fall, being able to utilize that to basically graze later. And so it's about mid-August. We ideally apply about 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen that can help boost that growth. And so when we're thinking about these stockpiled cool seasons, this trial was done up at the University of Wisconsin. And they applied 50 pounds of nitrogen in August, and they had 3 locations. This is just the average yield of the different cool season grasses they had. Not all cool season grasses are created equal, but they were able to graze from December to March, so they got a considerable amount of grazing out of this. Tall fescue is one of our best stockpilers. It does a really good job, and it typically holds its quality really well. And then comparatively, we can see how different grasses respond. We don't get quite as much out of our smooth brome grass in comparison. We can see that kind of go through. Orchard grass is another good option that does typically stockpile fairly well. As we're thinking about those cool season grasses and that stockpiled forage, we're also thinking about how is that forage quality holding on throughout that winter period. And it did vary among species. The one that comes to mind particularly is smooth brome grass. It does not hold its quality as well in comparison to like a tall fescue, but they saw on average about a 2% decrease in crude protein and 7% increase in ADF. So overall, they saw a decrease in digestibility over time. But I think that's a fair kind of a pretty okay trade-off in some cases and situations because you're still being able to get that grazing season further, but we need to be thinking about potentially supplementing later on in the season grazing period. They did see dry matter losses from August to March, a lot of through leaching and decomposition. I think it's kind of one of those things, if our winters are pretty mild, we have a lot of freeze thaw situations happening, a lot more leaching can be occurring and decomposition, where if we get cold and we stay cold, it's going to be able to hold on a little better. And then one of the last things that was looked at in another trial up in Wisconsin is just how valuable that extra application of nitrogen can be in these situations. And so if we're looking at this, they had 3 forages. They were looking at orchard grass, tall fescue, and meadow fescue. And we're comparing the yields for the different nitrogen applications. And so our zero nitrogen is in the blue, and then our green is 60 pounds of nitrogen, and then 30 is that gray color. And we can just see that little bit of a stair step situation. As they added nitrogen, they saw that increase. Particularly with fescue, they got almost a half a ton more dry matter in that situation by adding 60. And so as we're thinking about stockpiling, just some things that I like to think about going in is, one, we get what kind of forages do we have out there? And so what forages are in your pastures, that can help us kind of set aside and decide which ones we should be stockpiling potentially. Tall fescue, it typically yields well. It typically has a little bit lower curd protein than some of our other cool season grasses, but it can hold its quality really well. If we have, say, a smooth brome grass pasture and a fescue pasture that we decided to stockpile, grazing that smooth brome grass first is gonna really be beneficial because it doesn't hold its quality as well. You're gonna lose it fairly quickly. Fertilization, that 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen really helps boost those yields. Now, if we have those legumes in there, no nitrogen fertilization may be necessary at that point. Having that extra 30% on a dry matter basis of legumes can really help boost those yields. And then lastly, timing. We need about 60 days of growth for good biomass. Something that can be also beneficial is clipping or grazing fairly heavily right before we start those 60 days. Some people say 60 to 80, but that will kind of reset the plant and keep it in vegetative growth. If we don't do this and we have a lot of stems and a lot of seed heads out there, there could be a little bit more rejection occurring in while the animals are grazing. And then lastly, avoid grazing too early. We don't want to damage those plants because this is a perennial pasture. We're hoping to be able to graze it again next year and the year after. So really being able to utilize those throughout time. So making sure we're getting those at the right time and not grazing too early. Another thing that I like to think about stockpiling is potentially stockpiling summer annuals. I have seen a lot more interest in summer annuals in the last few years. And one of the things I always get is people are like, I graze them in the summer, but I always have a lot of summer annuals left over by the time that fall comes around. And so it's another opportunity that we could be thinking about. And so this is some data from Central Iowa. We had a multi-cutting system of pearl millet and sorghum Sudan grass. We cut this, but we can just kind of get an idea of what it could be looking like. And so we got about 2.5 to 3.5 tons per acre in 1 year. And then we got 3.5 to almost 6 tons per acre the next year during the summer. And then we allowed it to grow out after August. And then we harvested it again after killing frost in November. And allowing to do this, we were able to accumulate about 1.5 to 2.5 tons per acre in the fall, allowing these summer annuals to continue to grow. And so the idea behind this is once you kind of get through that summer slump period, that July and August, you can go back to your cool season pastures and then potentially come back to your summer annuals that could be stockpiled for later. And particularly after killing frost, I know there's a lot of concern with prussic acid production in our sorghum species, but after that killing frost, allowing it to sit for a few days and then going to it could be really beneficial. On top of that, there's been a lot of work that's been going on here in Central Iowa with swath grazing. And so it's kind of a similar situation to what I just described with stockpiling our summer annuals, but swathing it and then coming in and grazing it to hopefully increase the utilization of the forage that we have out there. And so This trial has been done at our beef teaching farm for a couple of years. This is basically they cut it in July. Estimated yield in July, as it was planted in early June, was about 1.5 to 2.5 tons per acre. And then they just let it grow out into winter. And then they swath it. So they come in and cut it and put it in swaths directly prior to when they plan on grazing. And they basically wait till the longest period possible, right before a snowfall or situations like that where they won't be able to get in the field, because laying it on the ground, especially before we get really kind of frozen, can probably increase that the breakdown of the forage. But basically they waited out. This one they waited until December 9th. And as you can see here, they were able to get about 1.5 to 2 tons per acre of dry matter for grazing. And then putting it in that swath, and then they strip grazed it. They're able to get a lot of utilization out of it, up to about 70% of utilization of the forage they had. So it was really, really efficient at grazing the forage that was there. And they just had some notes on the side that they were grazing from 3 to 12 inches in snow, covered in snow, depending on the time frame that was grazing. And then next, they looked at the nutritive value of how well this was holding up throughout winter. Crude protein, it started off really high in October, and then they swathed it in December. So they measured it at a killing frost, measured it when they swathed it, and then as they were grazing, crude protein did drop. Probably for some leaching situations, but it did maintain around 10% for our sorghum species. They grazed the pearl milla out a little bit further, all the way into February. It did drop again, but it kind of maintained again at that 10% crude protein. Their total track NDFD, they did see that declining throughout time. They saw that it basically was just, you're getting a little bit more fiber, we're leaching more of the soluble nutrients, we're increasing basically our fiber content, decreasing the digestibility of it. And so they saw that again, that same similar pattern, October, December to January with pearl millet. They did have a little spike in February, but basically as we're going throughout time and there's more time for that plant to decompose, we're starting to see it to decrease. And so one thing that I kind of think about, how could something like this be implemented? This would need a whole secondary field. And so that's one of the questions I get. And so kind of an idea behind this is you'd have your cool season pastures, and then you'd have a field that you'd be planting into summer annuals. You'd be utilizing your cool season pastures in early spring, and then plant your summer annuals late May, early June. You could go in, potentially graze them throughout the summer slump time frame, and then go back to those cool season pastures and allowing that summer annual to stockpile, and then you can go back and start swath grazing. And so it's just another opportunity to be thinking about how can I extend those grazing days. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about corn stover grazing. There's 12.9 million corn acres in Iowa. It's a lot of potential forage that we could be using. In Iowa, about 10 to 20% of the corn stover is grazed. I was pretty surprised. I thought that was higher than I was expecting, but that's pretty exciting. Utilizing the stover is a great opportunity for feed, and it can typically support about 1 animal unit on 1 acre for anywhere from 30 to 60 days, and that's going to depend on our yields of that corn. And we're going to get into how we can kind of start estimating that from some really good information from our neighbors in Nebraska. And so as I'm thinking about our corn stover, I'm thinking about the plant components. What are our plant components that we're getting? And so this chart here on the left, this is just a basically dry weight to plant components and breakdown. So our green is in blue. We have tassel, cob, and husk in red, stalk and leaf in the yellow color, and then leaf blades in the green. This is just relative to its growth stages, but really the big picture that I'm thinking about here is after harvest. One thing that you'll see is kind of the grain Ideally, all the grain is gone. Our combines aren't perfect. We do lose some grain on the ground here and there. And so we'll have a little bit of grain left, but the majority is going to be composed of that, basically the stover. And so this data here on the right comes from some work that was done out in Nebraska, grazing crop residues. And so what we can see is that typically we start off with pretty good, depending on what plant part we're looking at, pretty good quality. Our leaves, we could be at about 6.5% crude protein with pretty high IVD&D at about 46%. Our husks are kind of one of the best aspects for our corn stover grazing, and that's going to be sitting at about 61% dry matter digestibility. And then our stalks, not so much. When we start getting just to our stalks and our cobs, it's really not going to be very much quality left. And then our grain, of course, is aspect, but that's something that we're not going to be relying on because it really should be a small percentage of what we see out there. And so from this work, they broke down what they were seeing in some of the fields. Grain about 4% of the component to the leaf and the husk about 45%, and the stalk about 40%. And so you can start to see kind of what is going to be in the field. Now, granted, I don't know about you in your area. This year, I've seen a lot of corn on the ground, and so too much corn on the ground or grain on the ground can be problematic. So just making sure we keep an eye out for how much is out there is going to be important to ensure the health of our animals. And so as we're thinking about corn stover grazing, we should be thinking about what's going to be grazed first, because it's not going to be grazed as evenly. A lot of times our animals are going to start with the grain, then they're going to go to the leaves and husks, then they're going to go down to the stalks and the sheets. And so that's going to really decrease the quality that's out there. And so by the time that our leaves and our husks are gone, those animals we really should be considering moving those animals or supplementing very heavily. And so really having an idea of what's in the field can be really beneficial to make sure that we're doing this well. And so just some final thoughts on the corn stover grazing. Basically, let's start when the field is ready, ground is dry. A lot of concern I get on corn stover grazing is, how is this going to impact my next year? Our environmental conditions will influence forage quality. So basically, if we're doing a lot of freeze-thaw cycles, we're going to get a little more leaching, decomposition occurring. Field considerations, going back to that ear drop, a high ear drop, 8 to 10 bushels per acre. We really should be thinking about careful grazing. We don't want to, we want to make sure those animals are having a balanced diet. Too much grain can be problematic. On estimation, about 112 8-inch cobs equals 1 bushel. And that can kind of just give us a start on getting an idea of how much grain is on the ground. And then lastly, as you're thinking about how many animals can I feed, we can start thinking about how much feed is out there. And so 1 bushel is approximately 16 pounds of husk and leaf material. And so if we have a 200 bushel corn crop, that's about 16 pounds of that husk and leaf material. We're not including stalks in this because you don't really want to keep your animals eating those stalks. Is about 3,200 pounds of dry matter. And then you can start breaking it down on how many animals, how much intake is those animals having, and how long we can keep them out there for. And so lastly, I just want to be thinking about this implementation and just some final thoughts here. And I think one of the things I get a lot of times with a lot of our winter grazing strategies is the limitation is fencing and water. And so getting fence in the ground when the ground is frozen, temporary fencing, not very easy. And then also a lot of our fields don't have permanent fencing anymore. So it can be a limitation, but especially internal fencing, things such as virtual fencing could be really beneficial in being able to rotate our animals through our fields and being able to utilize that forage better. I loved Yijie's picture at the end there. You really could see how those animals were utilizing that forage and how well they were utilizing it. Those stark lines was very exciting to me. And then waters. Water can be a really big limitation. In this, there are ways we can start transporting water tanks. and things like that. So we might have to start thinking creatively here. And so then finally, when we're thinking about utilizing this, I like to think about how can we utilize that forage to the best of our ability. And some of those different grazing strategies can be really promising, such as strip grazing. Strip grazing, as you move that fence forward, and all the ones I talked about today, you really don't need a back fence because those animals, the forage is not going to regrow. So the animals are going to move forward as you go. And so that's how they were able to get 70% utilization with their swath grazing. This is an example of the swath grazing that's been done in central Iowa. You can see the swaths run parallel with the fence line, and they just move it forward, and the animals go to the next swath, able to graze that down and go to the next one. And so it's a really good opportunity. And if you're moving animals very frequently, things like that virtual fence could come in handy. Also, other things, technology such as the tumble wheel. It's a temporary fence tool that rolls instead of you having to stick it in the ground. When the ground is frozen, getting a temporary fence in the ground can be difficult. And so it's just another way to just be thinking about how we can utilize the tools we have available to us. And then finally, there's other strategies like cover crop grazing, which I should have looked at what I sent Fred a while ago because I thought I was just thinking winter grazing strategies. And I think I told him cover crops specifically, but cover crops are a great opportunity as we're moving throughout the Midwest to kind of get an earlier grazing in the spring or longer grazing in the fall. And just like Yijie's photo, grazing those oats since November now, great opportunity. And then varying strategies can increase those grazing days up to 2 to 3 months. And then even thinking about stacking strategies could be really, really valuable and really extending our grazing throughout the whole season. And then lastly, overall reducing cost, trying to make sure that we can get our animals grazing as much as possible in a lot of situations can be really beneficial in reducing feed cost. It's one of our biggest our biggest cost in the year. And so finally, one thing I just want to leave everybody on is we got to plan ahead. A lot of these strategies, we can't just turn it over tomorrow and start doing. We got to be thinking about these ahead of time. How are we planning to do this? It's always good. And then also taking notes on what worked and what didn't work the year before, learning from our mistakes to be able to continue to grow. I think planning a grazing strategy is great, but we got to be creative and we got to be willing to adapt as well. So just planning ahead, taking notes, we can learn a lot from each year. And with that, I can stop and take any questions.
Shelby, thank you very much. If we have a question, we can probably, we're a small enough group. If you want to just go ahead and open your mic up and ask, we got time for one question before we get into Amber's outlook. Okay, not hearing any, we'll just go ahead. Amber, if you want to go ahead and bring your slide deck up. Our next presenter is Amber Friedrichsen. She will provide a hay market report from what she's seeing across the country. She'll discuss the impact of high cattle prices, weather, and other plant pressures in her program today. Amber's the author. She is the managing editor for Hay and Forage Grower. She joined Hay and Forage Grower staff as an associate editor in May of 2023. In July of 24, she assumed the role of managing editor. She's also served as editor intern in 2021 and 2022. She graduated from Iowa State University in May of 2023 with a double major in agricultural communications and agronomy. Amber grew up and worked on her family's diversified crop and livestock farm in eastern Iowa near Clinton. Amber, the podium is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Fred. Is Everything looking okay on your end?
Absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. Let me get my little laser pointer here. Um, so I suppose I'm gonna offer an outlook for hay prices and hay market dynamics as we kind of head into 2026. But I think before we really look ahead or, create any predictions for what's going to happen this year, we kind of have to take a step back and look at what happened in 2025 as far as forage production goes. And this picture here kind of tells an important story, especially for first cutting last year. This was taken in a hay farm in central Illinois during the last week of May. So typically, when we start to think about first cutting of hay throughout the Midwest, and just a little bit of some behind the scenes information. This farmer kind of hopped up in the tractor and fired up his mower just to cut about 2 to 3 acres of this alfalfa orchard grass mix. Um, just so we could take some pictures of him in the field. Otherwise, he wasn't going to be cutting any other hay fields that day. There was rain expected overnight, and there's rain in the forecast the next day, and the next day, and so on. So that was kind of a common theme during the early part of the growing season. I think for a lot of producers in the Midwest, it just seemed like there wasn't a good stretch of 3 to 4 days of dry weather for those farmers to get hay cut and dried and baled efficiently. And of course, that has its own implications. Every day that forage is not cut on time, it loses quality. And as that quality drops, yield increases as plants continue to grow. So I think a lot of farmers ended up with a higher quantity of lower quality hay than what they expected, especially because our first cutting yields make up a pretty large chunk of our total season yields. So before I get too far into the weeds, let's see, I can't advance. Here we go. I just want to offer a little bit of a reminder or a disclaimer here that forage production and market trends are regional issues or topics. So the prices and the numbers that I present throughout this presentation might not resonate with you exactly. They might not be the same as what you're seeing, but I just hope that the overall trends are more important to note. And there might be other sides of the story in other locations. With that said, kind of a little bit more information. What have we been dealing with? Like I mentioned, a lot of early season rainfall, and sometimes this came in excess. So, in some cases we might welcome all of that moisture, especially where we may have been affected by drought the previous fall. But I think a lot of cases this spring rain kind of occurred in heavy or severe formats and maybe caused more damage than it may have helped, which kind of added fuel to that fire. So, as that wet spring kind of evolved, we were faced with more dryness than some farmers may have wanted into the summer and into the fall. And dryness and drought conditions have their own negative effects on forage yield and quality as well. We have been seeing some pretty low commodity feed prices, specifically corn and soybeans. Um, why am I bringing this up? I guess hay prices have historically followed commodity prices, just as another competitive feed source on the market. So, when we think about where hay prices are going, or maybe why they are so low and why they have been so low, we can look to commodity feed price trends as one of the factors impacting hay prices and one of the factors impacting the hay market as a whole. Some other factors that we consider when we're looking at hay prices and market dynamics are our hay customers. So I have received a couple questions recently about high beef prices and how does that impact the hay market. You might consider, extremely high beef prices being a positive thing. High prices support high prices, but on the flip side, our beef herd numbers across the US are extremely low, I think at record lows at this point. So even though beef prices are high, supporting that part of the industry, there's just fewer cows to feed on that side of the equation. kind of a different story when we look at the dairy industry, another consumer of hay. Um, Overall, there are more milk cows on U.S. farms. I think milk cow herd size nationally is higher than it's been in recent years, and production per cow is up as well. So total milk production is really a high point right now in the United States. But on the flip side, that dampens milk prices. So kind of a different story for the dairy industry, although there might be more cows to feed hay, farmers might have less money to purchase that higher quality hay that dairy cows require. A couple other factors here that weigh in on our hay prices and our hay market dynamics. Total forage production. Um, Harvested hay acres and yield per acre, all of that factors into total forage production. Those are yet to be announced for the year. USDA will report all of those numbers in its annual crop production report that comes out on Monday, January 12th. I wish I had those numbers here to share with you today, but they're kind of to be announced. With that said, earlier predictions kind of hinted at similar production numbers compared to 2024. And that's just something to consider as total production can influence our hay prices if there's an oversupply. December 1st hay stocks will also be included in that Monday USDA report. And again, that can weigh in on hay prices as well. Higher hay stocks support lower prices because supply kind of outweighs demand in those cases. I think there has been some expectations of variable hay stock inventory across the country, and most of that would be likely due to sporadic weather and just different demand than what we've seen before. So taking a look at some temperature and precipitation maps so we can kind of piece together what happened on the production side back in 2025 and kind of focusing on the Midwest here, obviously, considering our audience on this program, we can see it wasn't necessarily super hot this summer, but on the right-hand side, our precipitation maps kind of show that we did receive more moisture than normal. What these maps don't really tell us, though, are those severe weather events, torrential rainfall, and other maybe unwelcomed precipitation patterns that may have caused damage to fields or crops or, delayed our first cutting, like I mentioned in the first slide. So, and I didn't mention that these maps are from June through August, so kind of a big bulk of our production season and comprising most of the time that we would be in the field harvesting hay. As we entered later into the summer and into the fall, rain kind of shut off in many regions. The drought monitor map here from that same period, June through August, stays relatively free and clear of drought throughout the Midwest, which was a good thing. But as we look at the drought monitor map at the end of October, we can kind of start to see where dryness and moderate drought started to take hold in the Midwest, specifically, in Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. I think the Dakotas were pretty well off as far as moisture went, and hopefully as far as their hay season went as well. But ended up being a very dry end to our hay production season as farmers wrapped up those final cuttings, as well as corn silage harvest, which, is wedged in between hay harvests as well. And I'll get to that in a couple slides here too. A couple more maps here. Hang with me. I love maps. But these are soil moisture conditions for that, fall period. This is at the end of September. In general, I think it's just important to consider soil moisture, especially for those overwintering crops, our perennial forage species, perennial hayfields and pastures. For example, alfalfa being a perennial crop, it's just important that there's adequate soil moisture so that when it starts to prepare for winter dormancy, it's not super stressed before the season is over. So on the left-hand side here is root zone soil moisture, and the right-hand side is surface soil moisture, excuse me. So it looks a little bit dry, I guess you could say, especially in that northeastern Illinois patch. Again, the Dakotas seem to receive pretty adequate moisture for the end of the growing season. So kind of a mixed bag here as far as soil moisture conditions go at the end of the growing season. And I will note that these maps looked very much improved compared to the year prior. On the 2024 soil moisture maps, it was just bright orange and bright red, kind of all over the place. So maybe we were in a more positive position entering that winter dormancy period compared to last year, even though I know there's plenty of other factors that can weigh on alfalfa overwintering and other perennial crops as well. So looking a little bit at corn planting conditions, just wanted to note these in case there's any corn silage producers in the audience or if just for some reference too. Things were mostly on time or ahead of schedule compared to last year. This report from the USDA denotes the 18 most major corn producing states in the US. So at May 11th, 2025, we had 62% of the corn in the ground for those major corn producing states, which, like I said, was ahead of schedule compared to the previous year. In those I states, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, that produce the majority of our corn, were also off to a good start as well. So, kind of a different story. I guess our first hay cutting was not favorable, but those planting conditions didn't seem to get in the way of corn planting as much. Corn silage harvest is a little bit of a different story. As we consider how the wetness early in the season turned into dryness later in the season, I think it was kind of to be expected that things weren't as positive on that end. Dry conditions kind of took hold. I think corn experienced a lot of drought and heat stress, starting when pollination occurred and then throughout the harvest season whenever corn was ready to harvest for silage. And this combination of a wet spring and a dry late season caused a higher frequency of disease pressure, especially hearing higher frequency of tar spot and southern rust on our corn. So I think a couple months ago, we were waiting to see how this was going to affect forage quality, and maybe we still are, but at this point, some farmers might be opening up those silage storage units and feeding out the crop that they harvested last fall. I think a general rule of thumb is usually by Christmas time, you should be able to open up your fall crop of silage. Hopefully, it had enough time to ferment in about 3 months' time. So, yeah, we might be at that point already. But I just wanted to share a little quote from our last issue of Hayden Forage Grower back in January. Our columnist, John Gazer, kind of summarized corn silage harvest by region. So he had a summary for Western states, Midwestern states, and Eastern states, what he was seeing in the field there. And he said the Midwestern corn silage crop was a quote unquote fascinating beast. So, whatever that means, John said it has mixed energy potential, and the variation is beyond what is normal. So, I think his observations, along with many others, just make it that much more important to test our corn silage before feeding it to livestock, especially considering that variable growing season conditions that we experience there. So, kind of turning our attention to hay market prices. This is a graph of May 1st hay stocks. So the USDA reports hay stock inventory for May 1st and December 1st every year. And like I mentioned, that December 1st number will be coming out next week on Monday in that annual crop production report. So stay tuned for that. It's a little bit more timely and relevant information. But back in May, we learned that hay stocks were up 15% year over year, so sitting at 24.1 million tons of hay compared to 2024. And that followed a 47% increase from May 1st, 2023 to 2024. So overall, we were up to the highest reported May 1st hay stocks inventory since 2017. And that is just important to note because, again, hay stocks can affect hay prices. With more hay available in hay barns across the country, prices are more likely to stay low. Um, Again, maybe waiting to see what those December 1st hay stocks look like, if there was any fluctuation or major changes there. That'll just offer some insight into how well hay prices might be buffered if any other negative production factors occur, like knock on wood, maybe poor um, weather as we get into next season's harvest. So overall, just a lot more forage inventory compared to several years prior, and that's one of our major factors that we consider for hay prices. So breaking things down a little bit month by month, this is a graph of monthly alfalfa hay prices reported by the USDA. So back in November, for which is the most recent data we have available, average alfalfa hay went for $159 per ton. And that's an average of all quality types, so fair, good, premium, supreme quality hay, all put together and weighted by volume. So $159 per ton. As you can see, that was down year over year. Those orange bars represent 2024 hay prices. And I wanted to add our 2023 hay prices here in pink, just for reference here, because 2023 was a record hay year. Actually, 2022, 2023, just a couple years ago, we experienced record high hay prices for a number of factors there as well. We were coming out of a pandemic year. There's also severe drought in the months and years prior. So that's how the hay market responded back then. And now we're kind of just on a deep downward slide from those record prices only a couple years ago. So much different situation in the hay market compared to a few years ago. As you can see here too, I just wanted to point out how the hay market tends to be pretty cyclical in nature. So every year around April or May, hay prices will peak. Here it is in 2025, peaked in May at $191 per ton. And then we see those prices kind of trail off as we get into the fall and the winter hay feeding season. I don't have many notes here as far as grass hay prices go, but just wanted to offer up a similar graph compared to alfalfa hay prices, just to show it's a little bit more of a steadier market, but our average grass hay prices are still low compared to years prior. So yeah. This here is a graph for our supreme and premium quality alfalfa hay prices. This comes from a report by USDA, which averages the top 5 dairy states reported values for supreme and premium quality hay. So those states are California, Idaho, New York, Texas, and Wisconsin. And they use these numbers for the dairy margin coverage program. So very kind of dairy perspective here, but just wanted to offer up what is being reported in terms of supreme and premium quality hay. Our most recent data for this is from November at $223 per ton, but I wanted to point out that this average price probably isn't going to reflect your local price for supreme and premium and other higher quality hay prices. With that said, I did a little bit of digging here, with my Iowa bias, being an Iowa State grad, I looked up some Iowa hay auction statistics as far as higher quality hay goes. As of recently, the Dyersville hay auction that you see here recently posted dairy quality hay, which I would expect to be that higher premium to supreme quality hay at $215 per ton back on December 17th. Just a couple days later, on the other side of the state, the Rock Valley hay auction posted large round bales of premium quality alfalfa at $150 per ton. So again, much lower than that $223 per ton number we saw on the previous slide, and just kind of an example that in our region of the Midwest, at least, high quality hay is not going for that premium price that farmers in other regions are seeing. Speaking of other regions, I know hay exports aren't that relevant to us here in the Midwest, but they play a much larger role for Western hay producers. Export demand has been down as well on the hay front, especially alfalfa hay. Just for an example here, our alfalfa hay exports to China from January through September of last year, down 22% year over year. This is just important to note because China is our country's largest export market for alfalfa hay. In previous years, China took more than half of our alfalfa hay leaving the country. So to see this 22% decline year over year is pretty drastic. And as you can see, quite a bit lower than previous years as well. There's a couple factors that play into this depressed export demand. In China's case, might have been affected by trade tariffs earlier this year. There's other dynamics that are shifting within China as far as their demand for hay goes to feed their livestock there. And I think in other markets, for other types of hay, the exchange rate between the US dollar and other types of currency can be a challenge as well. So again, I know hay exports aren't much of a concern if you're not a Western hay producer, but still shows how prices can be affected by supply and demand. So with all of that said and all of that information and all of those numbers, can we really predict where hay prices are headed in 2026? I would say there's really no sign of those hay prices improving. That might be bad news if you're someone who makes hay and sells it on the commercial market. It might be good news if you're buying those bales, but just know that part of the reason for lower prices could be because of a oversupply of lower quality hay. And that could have been impacted by our weather challenges last growing season. Again, commodity prices will likely stay low. There's really no sign that corn and soybean prices are going to improve anytime soon, especially considering our good production numbers last fall and grain that is still in storage waiting to be sold doesn't incentivize any movement on the market there. As we think ahead to the rest of our winter hay feeding season, future hay stocks could influence market prices as well. Also could influence prices depending on how our start to the 2026 hay season goes. Both beef and dairy markets are pretty unsupportive of any movement in the hay market, but for different reasons. Again, lower beef cow numbers across the country create lower demand for that hay. And on the flip side, from the dairy industry, low milk prices might be encouraging farmers to go out and find other sources of feed rather than more expensive, high quality hay. With that said, though, I don't think hay prices can get much lower, especially considering the cost of production and just what producers need to sell their hay for in order to make a profit after making it and taking it to the auction. So that might be something to consider. If you haven't sat down and calculated your production costs lately, I would encourage you to do that just so you know you're not selling yourself short when it comes to selling hay. But above all, weather is going to probably be the most important factor here. As much as we can go back and forth and speculate how these other factors are going to play into the hay market, it really comes down to how the weather is going to shape up and how well we can cut, dry, and bale our hay at the start of the 2026 growing season. Just a quick look at forage seed supplies here. I'm sorry this is kind of an afterthought, but this chart was also published in our January issue of Hay and Forage Grower, just outlining different forage species and the supplies for those seeds. So if you're looking to renovate any pastures or hay fields or establish new forage stands here, it's probably best to jump on that sooner than later. I hope that this is still relevant too, published already this month. Those tight and extremely tight supplies could be dwindling. So I guess just get out there and buy your seed if that's what you're looking to do for this spring planting season. And in summary, I think that 2025 was just another example of extreme weather conditions. I'd say that for extreme wet to dry conditions, seeing that major shift from the early season to the late season, but also just an increase in intense precipitation patterns that we've been seeing more and more as well. Overall, hay prices are weak, and I think they will continue to be. And also, high quality hay may be in short supply. with that all said, I think it's important to take inventory of your forage and the rest of your feed supplies now. That's really the only way that we can guarantee our position to feed cows for the rest of this winter and cover our farm expenses until we can get in the field in the spring. And when you're feeding your livestock, the only way to know forage quality is to test it. That's going to be even more important this year as we consider all of the variations that could negatively impact forage quality. And we really need to test our hay to make sure that our livestock are getting the nutrition that they need. So that is all I have for you guys on tonight's program. Any questions, feel free to contact me at my email here. Also, can visit hayandforagegrower.com, search our catalog of all kinds of articles. And then I also just wanted to plug here our weekly newsletter goes out Tuesday mornings. It's called eHay Weekly, and you can sign up for it on the website, as well as subscribing to our Hand Forage Grower print magazine, which is published 6 times a year. So with that said, I'll turn it back to you, Fred, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Amber. Appreciate the information. If folks have questions, go ahead and just unmute and ask them directly. I don't see any questions in the queue, and I'll give just a second if someone's got one to unmute. Otherwise,
I got a quick question, slash comment, I guess, too. The one is a comment of your corn silage comment of like it was I forget the exact term you used, but interesting. That we saw that here so much. Just you turned around and it seemed like your corn silage was dry like within a week. And so very interesting here. So I'm excited to see what happens when people start feeding it out. Question. Do you see, I know we said we had a lot of low quality hay. Do you see premium hay prices going up or just everything kind of staying low overall?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the term you're looking for was fascinating beast for
That's it. Yes. Fascinating bees. Thank you.
it's right there in print too, so interesting term. But yeah, I haven't seen anything dramatically increasing as far as the higher quality hay goes, even though it's in shorter supply.
Mhm.
I think overall hay prices just aren't really an optimistic, thing.
Yeah, unfortunate.
with the conversation we've just had, are these low prices putting stock bales in competition with hay? Is that why we're seeing some support on the stocks that they throw that in the grinder instead of hay or not?
Well, I guess the hay stock inventory is just all the bales that are in storage. So, I
No,
think,
corn, I was meant corn stock
oh,
bales
I
is what I
gotcha.
was talking
Oh,
about.
wrong version of stock. Yeah, I guess I don't know that. I haven't come across anybody turning to corn stalk bales for forage who haven't necessarily practiced that before, but that might be another forage source if they're in a pinch.
It just looks like when I look at the market report that stocks and average hay don't have that same distance that they have in other years. So, okay, I got a question here. Uh, go back to uh, Shelby. There's been a couple of recent articles about these systems that have 20 and 30 different species in a pasture, in a forage system. What's your thought on that?
So my thoughts is when you have 20 to 30 species, the best thing you're gonna always have something that grows. Something is gonna happen. Typically though, I like to see something like 3 to 5 species because when you have 20 to 30 species, most likely you're not gonna have enough of all of those species to see the benefits of those species. And so I always go back to thinking about how many legumes on a dry matter basis do we need for nitrogen? And so 30% of it dry matter. But if we only have one or two of those species in a 5-foot area, you're probably not going to be seeing the benefits of those 30 species. But a really targeted mix could be really beneficial, of things that are going to grow well together and complement each other could be really beneficial. There's not a lot of research out there that says the 20 to 30 weight mixes will do better in comparison to a simpler mix or even sometimes a monoculture. But yeah.
Okay. This is E.G. This is a question that I had a couple of months ago and hadn't asked it yet. Can you use these virtual systems to assist in weaning?
Believe it or not, this is quite a common questions for uh from producers as well. So, and knowing my background is in engineering, it might not be super tailored for weaning. However, based on my understanding is if you have really thought out scheduling and planning and knowing how to read the data, I think you can do it. Now, if you're asking if any of these colors have those features yet, the answer is no. Uh, but I'm not trying to do more work. There are enough producers question that we might consider doing some sort of research to see how effective you can do. Theory wise, I do think it's doable. Um, it may not be 100% accurate, but I do think you can probably separate heavy and lighter ones pretty creatively.
Okay. Shelby, we'll go back to you. Uh, and I'm going to make you walk through it with maybe just a bullet point or two. What can you walk us through the use of cover crops in winter grazing?
So there's a few different ways that we can be thinking about using cover crops in winter grazing. I think Yijie's photo there of using oats, it's something that would grow really well in the fall if you get time, if you have time to plant it and get the growth. And so it's kind of a depending on what species you use and when you're going to probably be grazing it. Now in Iowa, we have a lot of a corn soybean rotation. And when you follow corn and soybeans, there's not a lot of time for growth. So a lot of times we're looking at a cereal grain. And so we're looking at trying to get earlier growth in the spring to be able to get our animals out earlier. And so things like cereal rye take off really well in the spring. You can get some grazing occurring earlier. And so it's either you're kind of extending out into the fall or you're kind of getting earlier grazing, depending on how much time you have in the fall to plant and for that plant to grow.
Very good. Final comments. I'll first ask the audience if they've got a question. Go ahead and unmute and fire it off. If not, I'll start from the final speaker. Amber, anything you want to leave the audience with?
No, I guess I don't have any final thoughts. I should have come prepared with some, but just thanks for having me on the program tonight.
Always appreciate it. Shelby?
At least I didn't have to go first, but no, thank you for having me today. I think just kind of taking notes and planning ahead is going to be super important, especially because I mean, as Amber talked, we have very variable years now. It doesn't seem like we have a normal year, so we just got to plan ahead.
Very good. Yeah, when you figure out what a normal year is anymore, let me know here. E.G., any final thoughts?
Sure, I'm not prepared for this either. So I think my final thoughts would be like technology like virtual fence is a tool in your toolbox. So it might help you down the road or even right now. So be open-minded, and then any information, reached out to extension folks at ISU, Arizona, Nebraska, whatever the land grant university. We might have some valuable information for you already.
Very good. Thank you to our presenters for the information, and I remind everybody that the link to the evaluation will be sent to them when I send the reminder out once this program has been archived. It takes us about a week to get the program archived, so if you want to go back and hear something, you'll be able to do that. As always, I invite you to come back next month, and I thank you and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. At this point, we will be signing off. Thank you to my presenters.
Thank you.